November 1916. A field hospital behind the Somme. The smell is what you notice first. Antiseptic trying to cover rot, mud, gangrene. Then the sounds. Not screaming. Screaming would be expected. This is something else. A man in the corner, perfectly still, staring at his hands. Another rocking, humming a tune that hasn't been a tune for hours. A third convulsing without wounds, his body remembering what his mind refuses to process. On the intake table sits a leather-bound ledger. The physician opens it. His pen hovers over two columns, wounded and other. He writes a single word in the margin, functional. The man who cannot stop shaking will not be listed as injured. There is no category for what he has become. Before the sun sets, this room will sort 60 men into those who can return to the line and those who cannot. The criteria are not medical. They are administrative. And in a few minutes, you will understand why this became the most carefully hidden crisis of the Great War. Now, let us go back to the beginning. If you're drawn to histories that examine what institutions do when confronted with what they cannot acknowledge, consider subscribing. To understand what happened in that hospital room, we need to understand what these men believed about themselves before the war. In 1914, the men who enlisted carried with them a set of assumptions about courage that had been refined over centuries. The British public school system had spent decades engineering a particular kind of masculinity, stoic, unflinching, capable of absorbing hardship without complaint. The French spoke of élan vital, the Germans of Pflicht, duty. These were not just words, they were the architecture of the self. War was understood as a crucible that revealed character. You either had it or you did not. Cowardice was a moral category, not a medical one. When a man broke under fire, the question asked was not what happened to him, but what was wrong with him to begin with. The first soldiers to exhibit what would later be called shell shock were treated as isolated cases, tremors, mutism, paralysis without injury. The initial medical response was straightforward. Malingering. These men were pretending. The treatment was discharge, not to home, but to disgrace. By 1915, the isolated cases had become a pattern. Hospitals in England began receiving men who could not speak, could not sleep, could not hold a cup without spilling it. Their bodies had recorded something their conscious minds had not processed. Physicians documented symptoms with clinical precision. Patient exhibits gross tremor of extremities, no physical trauma observed, responds to sudden noise with disproportionate startle, pupils dilated, affect flat. The language was technical. The underlying question was not. If these men were not wounded and not pretending, what were they? The problem was not medical curiosity. The problem was scale. By the middle of 1916, British hospitals were admitting shell shock cases at a rate that exceeded battlefield injuries in some sectors. The French called it obusit, shell sickness. The Germans, Kriegsneurosis. Each nation encountered the same phenomenon and reached for the same uncertain vocabulary. The War Office faced a dilemma that was simultaneously medical, legal, and existential. If you acknowledged that the mind could be wounded like the body, you created a category of injury that had no visible proof. Any man could claim it. The entire structure of military discipline rested on the assumption that orders would be followed regardless of fear. If fear itself became a wound, the system collapsed. So a boundary was drawn, not by doctors, but by committees. The British Army convened a panel in 1916 to establish guidelines. Their conclusion was precise. Shell shock would be recognized only if it resulted from proximity to an explosion. A man buried by shell fire could be treated. A man who broke after days of constant bombardment could not. The distinction was not medical, it was administrative. One man's collapse was injury, another's was failure. This is where the ledgers become revealing. Medical officers were required to categorize each case using a specific notation system. Shell shock, W, meant wounded, caused by enemy action, eligible for pension. Shell shock, S, meant sick, a constitutional weakness, eligible for nothing. The determination often came down to whether an officer could produce a witness who had seen the shell explode. Let us pause here and consider what this meant in practice. A man stands in a trench for 72 hours under bombardment. He does not sleep. He watches the soldier beside him disintegrate. He smells burning flesh. He hears screaming that stops suddenly and silence that continues. On the fourth day, his hands begin to shake uncontrollably. He can no longer load his rifle. If a shell landed near him during that fourth day, he is wounded. If not, he is shirking. The distinction determines whether he receives treatment or court-martial. His mind has already made no such distinction. The trauma is identical. Only the paperwork differs. The files from courts-martial tell us what happened to those categorized as S. Private Ernest Atkins, 22, convicted of cowardice in February 1917. The trial transcript records that he failed to advance when ordered and exhibited trembling and incoherence. His commanding officer testified that Atkins had been satisfactory until 3 weeks prior, following an extended artillery barrage. The medical officer's report noted no evidence of physical trauma. The verdict was delivered in 14 minutes. Atkins was executed by firing squad at dawn. His death was recorded as discipline maintenance. In the ledger, his name appears with a small annotation, made an example. This phrase recurs throughout the records. The executions were not secret. They were instructional. Other men were required to watch. Here is what the system understood. Fear is contagious. One man's collapse threatens the cohesion of the unit. The response must be visible and certain. Compassion becomes a tactical liability. The choice presented is binary: advance or die. There is no third option for those whose minds have already chosen neither. But the men did not stop breaking. By 1917, the scale of psychological casualties forced a shift in approach. The British established specialized treatment centers. The French created neurological wards. The therapeutic method adopted was telling. It was called disciplinary re-education. Patients were subjected to deliberate stress, loud noises, sudden lights, forced marches. The theory was that the mind, like a muscle, could be retrained through repetition. What this actually meant was that men who could not stop shaking were made to shake harder until they learned to suppress it. Those who could not speak were isolated until speech returned, not because the trauma resolved, but because silence became unbearable. Dr. Louis Yayland, a prominent British neurologist, pioneered a technique he termed disciplinary persuasion. His case notes describe applying electrical current to the throats of mute patients while shouting commands. "You will speak," he would say, and increase the voltage until they did. He published his results in a medical journal. The cure rate, he reported, was impressive. What he called cure, the patients experienced as submission. The goal was never healing. The goal was return to function. A man who could hold a rifle was cured. A man who could follow orders was recovered. The psychiatric establishment of the era genuinely believed they were helping. They saw breakdown as weakness and restoration of control as strength. This is the moment to understand something crucial. This was not rogue behavior. This was protocol. The physicians who administered these treatments were not sadists. They were professionals operating within a framework that defined mental collapse as a failure of will. The system itself was the pathology, and everyone within it was complicit. The soldiers knew this. The letters that survive are remarkable for their clarity. One private wrote to his sister, "They want us afraid enough to obey, but not afraid enough to break. The line between the two is thinner than they know." Another, in a diary seized after his death, "We have all learned to pretend. The ones who cannot pretend are gone." The pretending became its own skill. Men learned to recognize the signs in themselves and each other, the distant stare, the too quick breathing, the hands that would not stay still. They developed systems of concealment. A reliable soldier would cover for one beginning to fracture. Officers who cared learned to rotate men out before they snapped entirely. These were acts of mercy that existed outside regulation, in the gaps where official policy had no language. But the gaps were small, and the pressure was immense. The Battle of Passchendaele in 1917 produced casualty rates that made concealment impossible. Men arrived at aid stations in states that could not be categorized as anything but broken. They wept continuously. They struck their own heads against walls. They pleaded to be shot. The medical corps had to make a choice. They made it quietly. A new category appeared in the ledgers. NYD, N. Not yet diagnosed. Nervous. It was a bureaucratic solution to a moral crisis. The men could be removed from the front without admitting what had happened to them. They were placed in holding facilities indefinitely. These facilities were not hospitals. They were waiting rooms. The men inside existed in a state of suspended classification. They were neither sick enough to discharge nor well enough to deploy. Some stayed for weeks, others for months. The records suggest that many never left. They simply disappeared from the rolls, transferred, reclassified. The language is always passive, the destination unspecified. What happened in those rooms is poorly documented. What we know comes from fragments, letters intercepted by censors, marginal notes in medical files, testimony from orderlies decades later. The picture is consistent. Men were kept in isolation. Food was minimal. Interaction was forbidden. In one facility, an orderly noted that a patient had scratched the number 87 into the plaster beside his cot, the days he had been waiting. Another file mentions a man who arranged breadcrumbs in rows on his bed frame, counting and recounting them. The treatment was waiting to break further or waiting to suppress enough to function. Some did suppress. They returned to the line. Their commanders noted that these men were recovered, but often altered. They followed orders with mechanical precision. They no longer formed attachments. They did not speak unless required. In modern terms, we would call this dissociation. In 1917, it was called satisfactory adaptation. Others did not suppress. For them, the options narrowed. Chronic cases were transferred to asylums far from the front. The families were told their sons were receiving care. The asylums were overcrowded, underfunded, and organized around containment rather than treatment. Men diagnosed with war neurosis were placed alongside patients with schizophrenia, syphilitic dementia, and profound intellectual disability. The distinction in diagnosis meant nothing in practice. They were filed under a single category, incurable. Here, the records become sparse. Asylum ledgers from 1918 to 1920 show hundreds of admissions marked war service, with no corresponding discharge dates. Some entries have a line drawn through them. Some have the word deceased with no cause listed. Some simply stop. The administrative assumption was that these men would not leave. The asylums became depositories for unsolvable problems. And then the war ended. The question of what to do with these men became acute. Demobilization required a clear administrative process. Soldiers were to be discharged, pensioned if wounded, and reintegrated. But the men in asylums presented a bureaucratic puzzle. They had not been wounded in a way that photographs could prove. Their injuries were invisible. The pension system had no framework for compensating psychological damage that could not be linked to a specific incident. So a solution was implemented. It was quiet, procedural, and devastatingly effective. The term shell shock was formally abolished. The diagnosis ceased to exist. Men previously categorized as shell shock cases were reclassified. Some became neurasthenia, a pre-existing condition not service-related. Others became constitutional psychopathy, a personality flaw. The language changed. The men did not. By 1921, the official position of the British War Office was that shell shock had been a temporary wartime phenomenon, largely the result of poor officer training and insufficient discipline. The solution, they concluded, was better selection and stricter command. The implication was clear. The men who broke were the wrong kind of men. The system had not failed. It had been contaminated. The files were sealed. Not destroyed, sealed. There is a distinction. Destruction implies guilt. Sealing implies future relevance, controlled access, the possibility of revision. The records were placed in the National Archives under a 100-year restriction. They would be opened in 2020. But some evidence could not be sealed. The men came home shaking, mute, violent, or withdrawn in cycles no one could predict. Their families had no framework for understanding what they were witnessing. The veterans themselves had no language for what they had experienced. The families wrote letters to the War Office, to Parliament, to the King. What happened to him? The responses were identical, stamped with bureaucratic courtesy. Your son is receiving care, medical privacy, national security. No further information can be provided. Some families hired private physicians. The diagnoses varied wildly: nervous exhaustion, moral insanity, melancholia. None of these terms appeared in the military files. The private doctors were diagnosing symptoms without access to cause. They treated insomnia without knowing about the 80-hour bombardments. They treated violent outbursts without knowing about the orders to advance over the bodies of friends. The context had been classified. The treatment was therefore guesswork. A few men wrote their own accounts. These memoirs are extraordinary documents, clear-eyed, precise, and utterly devoid of self-pity. They described the war not as chaos, but as a system. They described their breakdowns not as failures, but as responses. And they described the treatment they received not as medicine, but as a continuation of the same logic that sent them into the trenches. You will do what you are told. You will suppress what you feel. You will function, or you will be discarded. One veteran, writing in 1923, put it this way: "They trained us to kill without thinking. When we could not stop thinking, they trained us not to speak of it. When we could not stop speaking of it, they trained us to disappear." The disappearance was systematic. Pension claims filed by shell-shock veterans were denied at rates exceeding 90%. The standard rejection letter cited lack of evidence of service-connected disability. The evidence existed. It was simply inaccessible to the claimants. The catch was perfect. Prove you were wounded, but the proof is in files you cannot see. By 1930, the veterans had largely stopped filing claims. They had learned the lesson the system was teaching. There would be no acknowledgement. There would be no compensation. There would be silence. The silence held for decades. When World War II began, military psychiatrists quietly studied the shell-shock cases from the previous war. They reached a conclusion that was not made public. The breakdowns had been predictable. Every human being has a breaking point. Courage is not unlimited. The question is not whether a man will break, but when. And systems that do not account for this inevitability will generate casualties they cannot process. This understanding did not translate into policy. The same categories reappeared: combat fatigue, exhaustion, inadequate personality. Different words, same structure. The psychiatric casualties of World War II were handled with slightly more medical sophistication and exactly the same administrative denial. It was not until Vietnam that the diagnosis changed. Post-traumatic stress disorder entered the DSM in 1980, 62 years after the armistice. By then, most of the Great War veterans were dead. They died without diagnosis, without acknowledgement, without the language to describe what had been done to them and what they had done to survive it. The files opened in 2020 as scheduled. Historians gained access to the court-martial records, the medical evaluations, the pension denials. The scope became clear. Over 300 British soldiers were executed for cowardice or desertion. Thousands more were court-martialed. Tens of thousands were confined to asylums. The numbers are estimates because the record-keeping was deliberately fragmented. Different departments, different filing systems, different classification schemes. Opacity was built into the structure. What the files reveal is not cruelty in the traditional sense. What they reveal is a system optimized for a specific goal, maintaining combat effectiveness, encountering a phenomenon it had no capacity to process. The response was not to adapt the system. The response was to reclassify the phenomenon as individual failure. The soldiers were not betrayed by malice. They were betrayed by process. The physicians who applied electroshock believed they were curing patients. The officers who ordered executions believed they were preserving discipline. The bureaucrats who denied pensions believed they were protecting the treasury from fraudulent claims. Everyone was acting rationally within their role. The machinery was functioning exactly as designed. And that is what makes the documents so disturbing. There is no villain to identify. There is only structure. An apparatus that demanded men suppress their humanity to perform their function. And when that suppression failed, the same apparatus redefined failure as a character flaw. In the margins of some medical files, there are scratches. Not writing, scratches. Fingernail marks where the paper was gripped too hard. On the back of one court-martial transcript, someone wrote in pencil, "God forgive us." It was erased, but remains legible under certain light. These marks are the only evidence of doubt. The official histories of World War I focus on strategy, on trenches, on the poetry of disillusionment. They do not focus on this: the systematic breaking of men and the systematic erasure of that breaking. It does not fit the narrative of heroism or even the narrative of tragedy. It is too administrative, too procedural, too revealing of what institutions do when faced with suffering they cannot afford to acknowledge. Today, we have PTSD. We have trauma-informed care. We have the language. But we still have the same question. When a system encounters people it has broken, does it adapt to them, or does it reclassify them as broken? The answer is in the files. In the ledgers with 2 columns. In the diagnoses that changed when the political need changed. In the pension claims denied, not because the suffering was absent, but because acknowledging it was inconvenient. The men who came home shaking, who could not sleep, who startled at car backfires for the rest of their lives. They were not mysteries. They were predictable outcomes. What remains mysterious is why the system that produced them spent a century pretending they were anomalies. The shell shock wards are gone now. The asylums have been repurposed. The files are open. But the question persists. How many men must break before we stop calling it their failure and start calling it ours?